Welcome to another in the series of discussions under the general heading of UNO authors. This fall, Dr. Bing Chen and I are discussing a series of Loren Eisley books. Loren Eisley is not a UNO author, but he is a Nebraska author, and we're enlarging the concept of UNO authorship to include Nebraska authors. Today, the book that we're going to discuss is Loren Eisley's first book, The Immense Journey. This is a little paperback copy of the book that I notice was purchased for the price of $1.45 back about 1958 or so.
It's $8 now.
It's $8 now. So it's worth the price. It's one of the bargains. The Immense Journey by Loren Eisley. We are talking about Eisley himself as well as about his works. And to talk about Eisley himself is to talk about an individual who is full of ambiguities and contradictions, but who nevertheless is a great poetic genius with an instinct for the nature of life. And if there is a book in which this comes out to a greater degree than any other, I think it may be his first book, The Immense Journey. Others might disagree with me, but I think I notice a tendency, Bing, and that tendency is for authors to reach the top of the mountain with their first book. And after that, everything else is in relation to that opus number one. I wonder how you feel about this book.
Well, I think The Immense Journey certainly ranks, was when I was a senior in engineering. We had an associate dean who taught a dean's lecture course, and one of the books that he made open to us was The Immense Journey by Loren Eisley, and I just happened to pick that from his description. And as I went through this one of the few books I would say that had a profound impact on my view of life and on my outlooks. And as I thought about that, I thought, well, this is a very private thing, and I was very thankful for the dean for opening a new world to basically a very narrow-focused engineering discipline. And it was not until about 15, 20 years later I just happened to be gazing through the New York Times book review, and they were talking about the most influential books of the 20th century. And lo and behold, among that grouping was Loren Eisley's Immense Journey. And I said, well, how very interesting that, that a book that had affected me so powerfully would have also affected a group as prestigious as the New York Times book review groups. Mm-hmm. So,
if you could describe it in a sentence or two, what's this book about?
The Immense Journey is the journey of life on this planet, spoken through the eyes of a poet. He uses a great deal of metaphor in describing out of his childhood and young adulthood experiences that he draws forth to paint this beautiful picture of the rise of life on this planet and the ascent of man as a part of that ongoing process.
It's a book about evolution, in other words.
Yes.
Now, when you read the book, do you get the feeling that evolution explains everything?
I think what Eisley does say pretty strongly is that life is, and the process which governs it is far too complex to be explained in Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin. He said, we can only get a glimpse, it's as Eisley describes it, a series of shadows moving into and out
where you have an instantaneous, perhaps, glimpse of something elusive lurking there. And that is as close as we can perceive of the rise of our species and of all life on this planet.
So there's always this mystery behind the scenes, behind the curtains. And Eisley maintains once more that he's not religious, and yet there are always these loopholes for what we would call, people of religious faith would call, the supernatural. He would stoutly deny that he had any belief in the supernatural, and yet his whole work is about the miraculous. And down to the very end of this book, you find him at war with the mechanistic explanation of the universe.
Exactly. Yeah, he could be likened, as one of my colleagues once said in her dissertation about Loren Eisley. She claimed him to be a modern shaman. That was the title.
And that's interesting that you should mention that, because he speaks of his great Speck. He has very few heroes, incidentally, but one of them was Frank Speck, his professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He speaks of him as a shaman, and he also mentions that some people thought he was. And I think some people thought that Loren Eisley was a charlatan, and some people thought that he was a shaman. Because there is another side of Loren Eisley that comes out in the book of Gail Christensen, his recent biography. It's entitled Fox at the Wood's Edge. And in this, Christensen really takes a very clinical view of Loren Eisley. And this comes as a shock to a lot of people who expect that Loren Eisley, just because he is so mystical, and just because his emphasis is spiritual, they expect that he will be a saint. And you read this biography and you find out that he was not a saint, that he was a normal human being like the rest of us. But to me, that's a very hopeful thing, that a normal human being can have this spiritual understanding. And so it doesn't worry me that we read, for example, in the book about how he shamelessly fictionalizes these friends of his. He makes material out of his friends for his books. Don't like that sometimes. Like, I used to have a friend. I have several friends. But I used to have a friend. I don't hear from him anymore, but, and I think he's long since gone to his eternal reward. I think that's the reason I don't hear from him. Anyway, at the top of, he wrote very interesting letters that were full of metaphors. And at the top of every letter, he would have these words in capitals: not material, not material. He didn't want to end up as an illustration in one of my sermons. So Eisley uses a lot of his friends, and I think that's one reason there's a little disenchantment. And sometimes he fails to give credit to his friends to whom he has a profound indebtedness. Like, for example, his friend Professor Gaffney at the University of Nebraska, a very close friend. He never once gets mentioned in Eisley's autobiographical sketch, All the Strange Hours.
Oh, yeah.
And another example is Bill Asner, the man who taught him anatomy at the University of Kansas. This is another aspect of Eisley's genius. Can you imagine going in, taking a crash course in anatomy, one summer session of anatomy, then landing on your feet in the fall semester, lecturer in anatomy at the University of Kansas. This happened during World War II, when many of the faculty at medical colleges were being drafted for the Army, and all of a sudden the University of Kansas Medical School needed teachers of anatomy. Eisley was there in anthropology, and so he takes this crash course in anatomy. Lands on his feet teaching anatomy in the fall. But later he uses his friend Bill Asner, who was his shepherd kind of, who led him through this whole experience and taught him anatomy, but he makes him out to be the villain of the piece when he talks about going into the area where the dogs are kept for experimentation. And this little dog looks up at him with pathetic eyes, pleading with him to save him from this needle that Bill Asner is carrying. And so these are things that come out in this biography. We need to understand that all heroes are human beings. And a person who can write like this doesn't necessarily have to be an angel in order to be a great writer. But now this book is about evolution, really. And now, right away, we have to deal with the people who call themselves creationists. And this is not new. 100 years ago, we had to deal with the creationists. Charles Darwin had to deal with the creationists, with the people who could prove from the Bible that the world was invented 6,000 years ago. Might have been 5,990 or 5,900 years ago, 100 years ago. But there are these people who suffer from the need to interpret the Bible literally, all the way. And so they can prove from the scriptures that creation took place at a specific time, and that creation meant 6 24-hour days, and at the conclusion of those 6 24-hour days, bingo, it was done. And so we have to contend with a kind of resurgence of that point of view today. And so the question becomes for many people, how can you believe in a creative process that is above and beyond human engineering and at the same time believe in evolution? And this book, to me, is a halfway house. It helps me to believe in the creative process, which is above and beyond the control of human reason, as well as believing in the development of life, the growth and development of life out of earlier form.
He uses a lot of his experiences growing up in Nebraska as the models for this immense journey, you might say. He starts off by describing the slit, a slit in a cut in a piece of earth, which exposes 10 million years of Earth history. And he does it in such a very, very eloquent way. He said it was the slit was a little sinister, like an open grave, assuming the dead were unable to take one last look. For over me the sky seemed already as far off as some future century I would never see. As I slid further and deeper into the green twilight, there was a skull embedded in the solid sandstone. I had come at just the proper moment when it was ready to be seen, the white bone gleaming there in a kind of ashen splendor, water-worn and about to be ground away in the next torrent. It was the face of a creature who had spent his days following his nose, who was led by instinct rather than by memory, and whose power of choice was very small. Though nor ancestor, there was yet about him, even in the bones, some trace of that low, snuffling world out of which our forebears had so recently emerged. The creature had never lived to see a man, and what was it I was never going to see?
So he was down there in that slit, in that cavern, exploring time, really. He says that's when